This is Tom Fox. Welcome to Everything Compliance, Shoutouts and Rants from episode 98. In this episode, we have the full quintet of Jonathan Armstrong, Matt Kelly, Jonathan Marks, Karen Woody, Jay Rosen, and Tom Fox sitting in as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now to our fan favorite of Shoutouts and Rants. And for those who are listening to this podcast on the audio format, I'm sorry you can't see the Cheshire Cat grins of our panelists because they look like they are loaded for bear. Matt Kelly, what do you have for us in way of a shout out and or rant?
Well, since I already had a mini rant earlier about whether Twitter could be legalized or held as a public utility or not, I'm going to go with a mild rant. I'm actually going to circle back to my cybersecurity talk that I had at the beginning of the hour with the SEC proposal. As much as I like some of the governance questions that the SEC is raising, there's some other parts of the proposal there that I really kind of wonder about. And I will give you an example, is that right now, remember I said that you would have to disclose material cybersecurity events. As proposed, the SEC would expect you to disclose one of those material events, even if a law enforcement agency has asked you not to disclose it. And for everybody listening, the thunk you just heard down the hall from you was your head of corporate security fainting at this proposal. That strikes me as exceptionally risky. The SEC has some language in there that basically, the imperative of the investor needing to know that a material breach has happened trounces any sort of law enforcement issues that a different agency might have. Not asking that you give away the whole store and the full details of your material event, but they do say that you might have to disclose this has happened, it's disrupted these operations, we're still trying to fix it, or we have fixed it. Like, let's think long and hard before we decide to pit regulatory disclosure against effective law enforcement. I would not be surprised if this idea gets left out of the final rule. I would hope it gets left out of the final rule, but I'm still kind of wondering how on earth did it get into the proposed rule, because it doesn't seem like a good idea to me.
Jonathan Marks, we will note with interest that the Kentucky Derby is coming up, so I don't know if you'll continue that vein of rant or not, but do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
No, I'm going to go with a different ass this week, Tom. Sorry. Anyway, I have two shout outs this week. They're kind of related. One is since I'm really a Philly boy, I have a shout out to Alec Bohm, who's one of the Phillies' third basemen, who after making two errors mouthed something to the effect that he hates this place. And that was actually caught on camera. And if you know anything about Philadelphia fans who throw snowballs at Santa Claus, they literally eviscerated him. With the next play being that was hit to him, they gave him a standing ovation as sort of a little bit of a grin, you know what. After the game, actually, Bohm, he fessed up to the fact that he actually said it and said that he was frustrated and he loved playing here. And I can go on and on and on, but I think the one great thing about Philly fans is that if you really own up to it, you become a hero. So at his first at bat the next game, he actually got another standing ovation. So I credit this young man for actually just hanging in there and, you know, taking it on the chin and actually owning up for his behavior. And I think we've all had those days where we all mouth something that, you know, that frustrates us. But, you know, I just give him a lot of credit. I think that's great. And on the same vein, you know, history made this week with Alyssa Nakken being the first woman coach in Major League Baseball history. So I thought that was an interesting moment as well. Good for her. You know, if you follow her story, she started as an intern and worked her way all the way up to the top. And I just think that's something that these young kids today really need to understand. You really do have to start at the bottom and work your way up, despite, you know, what some of the younger folks have told me. You can't just apply for a job and automatically on day two expect to be the CEO.
Karen Woody, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
I actually have a rant this week. And it's a rant I've been making for a lot of years, but we see it again just about a month ago. And this is kind of a nerdy one. It could be, maybe it should have been what I actually talked about on the actual show. But a month ago, March 18th, the DOJ issued a declination with disgorgement. And I just don't get it. I mean, the number of times I want to say that word doesn't mean what you think it means. The declination with disgorgement that happens on March 18th was with the agreement was with Jardine Group Holdings. And the gist of it is this company gets in trouble for FCPA problems, and pursuant to the now corporate enforcement policy, which is the codification of the pilot program that sort of launched this declination with disgorgement idea. Pursuant to that, they, again, issue a declination with the strings attached that the JLT group, this company, had agreed to disgorge about $29 million to actually the SFO, so the UK Serious Fraud Office. So we have a number of players here. There's a signed letter for it. And my rant is that there is a signed letter. And even in page 2, the top of page 2 says, pursuant to this letter agreement. And so my rant is that this is a non-prosecution agreement. That is not the same as a declination. So my rant is, again, I think words matter. I wrote about this almost 10 years ago when they started this. I've taken a lot of critique for it, and you can still come at me, but if you decline to prosecute, you cannot do that with strings attached. You can say, like, we won't prosecute you as long as you give us this money. That is a shakedown. That is not a declination. So call it an NPA because it is. That was my rant.
Jay Rosen.
All right, this is going to be difficult because my word is going crazy here and it has destroyed my story. So I will talk about this in general terms. I read something very touching in the Washington Post today. And you know me, I don't usually do touching, but there was a guy who worked in a produce aisle at the Publix in Florida. And every weekend, a mom and her little girl, Fiona, would come in, and she would come up and see this man, Gilnet, and give him a high five. And she called him high five. And she'd see him every weekend. And this was kind of like a ritual going to the Publix. Well, what happened was she kind of stayed away for a couple of years due to the pandemic. And then her parents decided to bring her in to see high five again. It goes on in the story that he bought her a pink bicycle for her birthday, and just a very touching thing. And it made me think about when I was a little boy in Manchester, New Hampshire. My mom used to take me to the Johnny Bank. And the reason we called it the Johnny Bank is because there was a coloring book that talked about how Johnny could save money by going to the First Federal Bank. And every Saturday I'd go to see my friend, who I called her Pal. I don't know if her name was Pal, but I'd go to see Pal and I'd get my lollipop. So I'd like to send a warm and fuzzy shout out to Gilnet, to Fiona, and all the Pats who reach out to their local communities, who tie people together, who build roots, and who do the nice thing. And in the show notes, we will have a link to the video of showing the reunion between Gilnet and Fiona. And that's my positive non-rant for the day.
So I'm going to start with a shout out, but you will see how quickly it evolves. And my shout out is to Margaret Atwood for writing The Prophecy of the Handmaid's Tale. You might think this is dystopian science fiction, but The Handmaid's Tale is actually alive in the great state of Texas in 2022. Now, I am not referring to the lieutenant governor who is now going to boycott Disney World and Disneyland because they actually spoke up about the anti-gay law in Florida. I'm not going to talk about the attorney general who has said the laws of the state of Texas don't apply to me. I'm not going to talk about the governor of the state of Texas who decreed that parents of transgender children would be investigated by the Department of Social Services or Child Protective Agency for child abuse and perhaps criminally prosecuted, or his bottling up of our foodstuffs at the border so that he can make a political point. I'm going to talk about the prosecutors in Starr County, Texas, who brought a criminal murder charge against a woman for having a miscarriage. Yes, you heard that right. They brought a criminal prosecution, charged a woman with murder for having a miscarriage. She was booked, she was put in jail, and she had to post bond. Here's the thing. There's no law in the state of Texas which criminally or makes it criminal for a woman to have a miscarriage, even if that miscarriage is based upon a self-abortion. But taking it to Margaret Atwood's level, that's now apparently the law in Starr County. Now, the prosecutors dismissed this charge when it was pointed out numerous times by numerous commentators that the anti-abortion law in Texas applies to those third parties who provide abortion services. But frankly, I can't think of a more larger example of the dystopian society that we now live in the great state of Texas than to charge a woman who's had a miscarriage with murder of her unborn child. So Margaret Atwood, you didn't write science fiction. You just wrote a prophecy for the state of Texas in 2022. That's my shout out.
I'm afraid I've got a rant, and I'm afraid the mild-mannered Armstrong of the past is on vacation today, and I'm afraid it's also longer than usual. Although I do have a catchy title this time, 2 funerals and a birthday party. It's almost like one of the lesser-known films of Hugh Grant. And in 2021, I attended 2 funerals of very close family members. For one of them, we went to the crematorium. We had to have less than 30 people. We couldn't have a wake for the funeral. And we stood on the roadside and distributed bottled water and crisps, potato chips, because that was all we could do to comply with the regulation. I went to a second funeral of a close family member. We went to the church where we had maximum numbers in the church. We weren't allowed to sing from somebody whose funeral who really loved singing in church. We weren't allowed to sing. We had to be masked throughout. I gave a reading and had to give a reading that started with a mask on and then took it off for the reading. We went to the grave in a cold, cold winter's day, and we weren't allowed to go inside. We sat in a car park with flasks of coffee to keep warm, and then we had to go home because we weren't allowed to meet. And on both occasions, people attended those funerals with maybe 5-hour round trips, and they couldn't stay over, and they had to attend the funeral, get in their car, and drive home. Meantime, our leadership, who'd put these rules in place, particularly Boris Johnson, what were they doing? Well, they were partying. They were having after-work meetings. And Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, attended a birthday party for Boris Johnson. Boris says it was after work and he was, quote, ambushed with a cake. But he should have known to leave that party. And even if work colleagues were there, and even if his wife had organised it, there was no need for his wife's friend, an interior decorator, to be there. And there was certainly no need for him to stay. He says he was only at the party for around 10 minutes, but he's previously told us he wasn't there at all. Even if it was 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes too long. And my story isn't unique. There are people who've suffered to a hugely greater degree than I have and my family have. There are people who've had to say goodbye to relatives on an iPad because they observed the rules. The very rules that the person who made would not keep. And I don't excuse Rishi Sunak for his role in this. As well as attending the party, and by the way, both of them have been fined by the Metropolitan Police for their attendance. In 2020, Rishi Sunak received warnings for his financial transparency. A former chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, the sort of watchdog for public officials, said that the Chancellor's disclosures left something to be desired. He said, and I quote, "He seems to have taken the most minimalist approach possible to this requirement. Perhaps Rishi Sunak should carefully read the 7 principles of public life to make sure he is fulfilling the 2 principles of honesty and leadership." And for somebody in a role like he was to be so straightforward would be a warning sign, I think, to every politician that they have to up their game. But what did we hear this week? Well, we heard that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person who's responsible for the tax affairs of the nation, has a wife who has non-dom status, which maybe saves her more than £2 million in tax, and he himself has green card status. A senior British politician saying that he intended the US to be his forever home, whilst his wife said that she intended India to be her forever home. And as if that wasn't bad enough, part of the wealth comes from a corporation that has lucrative UK government contracts and had furlough payments to keep them afloat and keep employees in jobs during the COVID pandemic. And have a wild guess who the signatory of those COVID payments is, and the author of the COVID payment scheme were none other than Rishi Sunak. So, whilst I have to say for legal reasons I'm not suggesting any legal wrongdoing, it doesn't look open and honest and transparent as the 2020 report suggested Mr. Sunak should be. And very quickly, why does this matter? Well, as you've said, Tom, I know, there's another brewing scandal in the UK over P&O. And the P&O CEO has said that he broke the law in dismissing sailors on P&O ships. Boris Johnson's reaction was to say that you can't be the CEO of a corporation when you admit to unlawful behaviour, and you must immediately resign. But it seems that if you're the Prime Minister of a country and you commit a criminal offence, you don't have to resign. How is that right? How can he complain that a CEO has to resign, but the leader of a country doesn't? And secondly, what was Rishi Sunak's first reaction to these transparency allegations? He launched an inquiry to try and find out who the whistleblower was. So, to add to the woes of lack of transparency, we're now going to find the messenger and shoot him. And again, that doesn't send the right message for corporations. We've sort of grown up, haven't we? There's the odd corporate scandal where corporations try and shoot the messenger. But as a general rule, we've learned over the years that you have to treat whistleblowers with respect, even if what they say is wrong-headed. And UK legislation and new EU legislation gives whistleblowers the type of protection that it seems that the country's leadership now thinks they don't deserve when they blow the whistle on their own lack of transparency. So sorry for that to be a long-winded rant, but I just feel it does need saying. I realise that here endeth my very slim chances of a knighthood, but we need our politicians to show firm leadership in a crisis more than ever, and we need them to do as they tell others to do.
Well, on that cheery note, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great episode of Everything Compliance, and we'll have to see what gifts keep on giving for the next time.
All right.
This is Tom Fox again. Hope you've enjoyed this episode's shout-outs and rants. I hope you will check out the full episode of Everything Compliance, the Elon, etc. edition, which posts on Thursday, April 21st, 2022. Everything Compliance and the special shout-outs and rants portion of Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to visiting with you again.